Hey everybody, today I'm going to be taking a look at Between Interpretation and Imagination by Leslie Baynes. This was sent to me by Erdmans, so I want to say thank you to Erdmans for sending me a copy for review. This is my honest take on the book. Before I jump into my typical review format, I'm going to cover the main idea of the work, some of the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then just my reaction thoughts at the end. Before I jump into that, though, I do want to mention the monthly book club selection as I reach for it here is J.R. Woodward's The Scandal of Leadership, which is a book I love, and we're going to discuss it in my Patreon book club online in the month of December. So if that's something you're interested in, or if you just want to get my What I'm Reading newsletters every month and be in more direct contact with me on Patreon, please check out the link for that below. But let's jump into this review. So, okay, this book is one of a bajillion books about C.S. Lewis, and I'm a huge all things Inklings fan. I love the Inklings. I love their primary works, but I also just love all the commentary and biographies, all that stuff. I just eat it up with a spoon. I read as much as I can, and so this is a new one in that whole kind of vein of publishing, and this has a specific angle, which is about C.S. Lewis's engagement with Scripture. Which at first, if you're someone who's very familiar with C.S. Lewis, you may, at first blush, you may think, like, really? Like, why? What is there to study there? At least that was my reaction to it. But this project is very, very, very fine-tuned and dialed in some surprising ways. And I'll tip my hand a little bit as to say it's very illuminating because of the specificity of the way that she is studying this intersection of Lewis's work and his study of Scripture. And so what this book does is it moves through broad sections. The first section is really a short kind of intellectual biography of Lewis, specifically around his engagement with Scripture. So she covers his introduction to Scripture. She covers the Scripture that he loves the most, notably the Gospel of John, and the role that all of this played in his very famous conversion to Christianity. And then she does talk a little bit about his more scholarly academic not commentary in the sense of like traditional Scripture commentaries, but his commentary on how Scripture has shaped his life, and also some of his interpretations of Scripture as those things took shape in some of his apologetic work that became famous in Mere Christianity especially, and then later on in his life. There's a short biographical section at the beginning, which is really interesting. It's not like super revelatory if you've read other Lewis biographies, but it's there. The middle section is the most challenging part of the book, and this is the thing I want to let fans of Lewis know about, because I think people should read this book, but fans of Lewis are going to be potentially taken off guard, because she is willing to be very critical of Lewis, something that sets this book apart. She's willing to be very, very critical of him, particularly his deployment of Scripture when he kind of gets out over his skis. As a medievalist, which is what he was, there were times when his engagement with higher criticism, with biblical criticism, he was frankly getting some things wrong, and in some pretty key ways. And that whole middle section is all about his more scholarly, academic, nonfiction writings that engaged with biblical criticism and biblical studies as like a scholarly field. And that's where she is the most critical of Lewis, is in that middle section. And she does very careful work to point out some of the errors he made. She doesn't get too much into speculating as to why he made these errors or where these mistakes came from, although she comments a little bit on that. But that middle section is quite critical in some cases, and it's gonna potentially... I come from the pop evangelical world that just fawns over Lewis and Lewis's writings, and so I can imagine some people from that world maybe being a little disgruntled by some of the criticism that she brings to Lewis's work. But I think that, if the work checks out, it merits attention, and I think her work does really check out here. I'll comment more on that in my reaction. But the third section of the book, just still covering the main idea, the third section of the book is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful summary of book by book of the Narnia titles, and book by book a summary of the scriptural allusions in each title. Some of those chapters are quite short, although the chapter in the last battle is pretty long, and it's just a beautiful, compelling tour through how Scripture formed the imagination of the Narnia books. And she argues that Narnia is his apex of his engagement with Scripture because he's deploying it in more of a literary and imaginative sense. So that's why, hence the title, Between Interpretation and Imagination. She puts forward these two poles of Lewis's engagement with Scripture, one being somewhat riddled with some serious mistakes, meaning his academic scholarly work, and then but then the abundant beauty of his imaginative literary work in the Narnia books, which are kind of the culmination of his, in her view, best engagement with Scripture. So that's what Between Interpretation and Imagination is all about. Quickly, now the research on this is astoundingly good, so good. She interacts very deeply and very directly with not just the primary, like the prominently known Lewis writings, Mere Christianity, Screwtape, Narnia, etc. She really interacts with so many archival works, letters, collected writings that are, talks he gave that were never even like formally published in big collections. She left no stone unturned, in my view, of Lewis's work, and the research shines brightly in this book. I think that she did an extraordinary job going deep into the recesses of what we have on Lewis, and it's part of what makes her, especially her criticism, so sound, I think, and so careful. She also interacts a lot with secondary stuff around Lewis and other people kind of in the orbit of the Inklings. And also when she's interacting with Lewis's interaction with people like Bultmann, for example, she also pulls on Bultmann's work. And she does really good biographical work at like drawing out some of the primary influences on Lewis's relationship with Scripture. There's a couple scholars in particular that she makes the case had a really, really like stamping formative effect on how he even thought about Scripture, and how that does and does not resonate with how many modern American evangelicals would, actually. So there's a lot of just interesting stuff that she digs up there, but the research is off the charts great. Really good. Now, the readability of this is it varies per the section of the book you're in. I think that middle section is the most slow and dense and dry when she's really digging into the details on some of his nonfiction stuff, his scholarly stuff, scholarly stuff, how's that for a phrase? When she's digging into his work with the higher critics, that's where it's the most slow, the least readable, I would say. But that last section with her commentary on the Narnia books is wonderful. I adored that section from a readability stylistic standpoint. I ripped through that. And it rekindled. I have a deep love of the Narnia books, like a lot of us who were exposed to them as kids do. But it rekindled my love for those books, and I actually put the book down thinking like, oh my gosh, I really want to read Narnia again. Like especially her chapter on the last battle was really, 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 really captivating, and I think that she brought a great stylistic kind of pen to that last section in particular. So this is a nonfiction book. It's argumentative, it's persuasive. So there's going to be some sections that are going to slow down when she's trying to really make important points. But the readability overall, it's fine. It just, it's up and down depending on the section of the book you're in. I probably spent too long on that. Now, my reaction to the book at the end of everything I've just said, I think this is a very successful book. It's shocking how many books keep coming out about Lewis and Tolkien in particular, and how so many of these books can still do something new. It still shocks me. And this book did something new for me, as someone who's read a good number of biographies and about Lewis and all of that. I still learned stuff about his life, about his biography. I learned stuff about his work in this book. And I will say, I talked earlier about some people maybe would be rankled by her critical tone of Lewis. It really didn't bother me. I actually found it kind of refreshing, because Lewis, in the setting that I grew up in, Lewis can be treated as a hagiograph. He can be treated as this untouchable saint, and he made mistakes. And he made some serious mistakes in some of his writings, actually, when it came to his approach toward Scripture, that are a little bit puzzling, as she kind of tips her hand that it's a little puzzling that he made some of these errors and these omissions, because he was such a significant scholar in so many ways, and yet he had these couple blind spots in some areas. And she does a great job. I'm not trying to get into too many examples, because I want people to read the book and like do some of the wrestling on their own. But one example I will say is that she digs deep into his famous Lord, Liar, Lunatic argument that was popularized in Mere Christianity. And that argument for a while has not sat well with me. It's kind of a popular talking point that people will jump back to, and it's quite influential. And if she's right about some of the mistakes he made that are somewhat detrimental to the formation of that argument. That's a pretty significant conclusion, but I think that she does a really good job taking pains to step through why she has come to the conclusion she has, that he made some real mistakes in terms of interacting with higher critics, and he misunderstood some of what the higher critics were actually saying about the text. And therefore, because of misunderstanding building upon misunderstanding, some of his arguments are just on really shaky ground. But importantly, when it comes to getting into nitty-gritty of defending the text, or defending things Christ said from the text itself, particularly in the Gospel of John, as it relates to the Lord, liar, lunatic argument. So there's a lot there to dig into that, I'm sure people are going to agree or disagree with her conclusions, but I think that she makes her conclusions carefully. That's kind of the point I was trying to make about the research earlier. And so that's going to rankle some people who love Lewis and think he can do no wrong. But I think if you want to humanize the man, and he was a human who made mistakes, I think this is one of the best models for how to interact with him as a fallible human. Because she also, while being critical in that one section and making pretty compelling arguments for her criticism, she also demonstrates a great appreciation for what he accomplished in his imaginative literary works. And I already said that I love that last section on the Narnia books, and I really did. It actually, that's a section that deeply increased and added a layer of my love to what he accomplished in those books. And what I love that she does in that section is she points out the explicit quotations of Scripture, which there's not that many explicit quotations of Scripture in Narnia, but there is a ton of echoes and allusions, a ton. And she does a wonderful job walking through those, pointing out when they show up. And it just points back to the beauty of those books and what remarkable thing it is that he accomplished in writing those later in his life. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, this is a careful and persuasive study that is willing to be critical of a really important historical writer and figure, but also is willing to be adulatory when it's appropriate, and brings hefty research to back up all those questions that the book is seeking to tackle. So I think for the Lewis aficionado, this is a really easy recommendation because it's unlike any other book on Lewis that I've read in some of the specific things that she's getting at. And at the end of the day, it's really respectful of the man. And so what more can you say from a book that is trying to do all that in one single volume? So those are my thoughts on Between Interpretation and Imagination by Leslie Baynes and published by Erdmans. Thanks as always for taking some time to watch.